She cleaned her father's hangar after his death, thinking it was just filled with old junk. But when she lifted the heavy cover, her breath caught. What was hidden beneath it changed everything she thought she knew about her father. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The road that led Catherine Miller back to her father's land cut through a wilderness of ochre earth and brittle grass, where the horizon trembled in the afternoon heat. The Arizona sky spread vast and indifferent above her car, pale blue and wind-scoured, the kind of sky that seemed to remember everything that had ever flown beneath it. She had driven since dawn, the miles folding quietly behind her, past shuttered gas stations and sun-bleached billboards that once promised adventure, but now whispered only of time. In the passenger seat beside her lay a small box of her father's belongings from the hospital, a watch, a ring, a dog tag dulled by years of wear. She had not opened it since the funeral. The house came into view near sunset. It sat alone at the edge of an old dry lake bed, a low, weather-beaten structure that leaned slightly against the wind. The paint had long since surrendered to the desert, and the porch sagged under its own history. Behind it, separated by a stretch of dust and weeds, rose the outline of a corrugated iron hangar. Its roof rusted to the color of old blood, its doors chained with a padlock heavy as an anchor. Once, long ago, the land had belonged to the government, an auxiliary airfield left over from the war. Her father had bought it in the 60s when such places were sold off cheap and had turned the hangar into his workshop. To the family, it had always been an embarrassment, his monument to stubbornness, a pile of junk and obsolete machinery. To Catherine, it was the smell of oil and warm metal that had clung to his clothes when she was a child, the faint hum of engines that filled her dreams. She parked in front of the porch and sat still for a long time, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the siding. The silence around her felt absolute. When she finally stepped out, her boots sank slightly into the dust. The air tasted of copper and sagebrush. She could almost imagine she heard the faint echo of an engine, far away and fading, the ghost of one of her father's test flights. But when she turned her head, there was only the wind and the distant hiss of the desert. Inside, the house smelled exactly as it had the last time she had been there. Metal shavings, old coffee, faint traces of machine grease and pipe smoke. Nothing had changed. The same battered armchair stood by the window, its fabric darkened where his hands had rested. The shelves still held his worn manuals on aerodynamics and combustion theory, their margins filled with tiny notes in his precise handwriting. The table by the window was littered with half-finished sketches of wings, struts, and airframes. Dust lay thick on everything, but beneath it she felt an unmistakable order. Her father had lived inside a pattern only he could see, a rhythm of bolts, wires, and dreams. She moved slowly through the rooms, her fingers brushing across objects as if afraid to disturb them. The floorboards creaked in familiar protest. In the bedroom, his jacket still hung on the chair, the fabric stiff with age, smelling faintly of gasoline and sunlight. She sat on the edge of the bed and closed her eyes, letting the quiet surround her until her heartbeat matched the pulse of the house. For a moment she could almost believe he was still here, just outside, working under the broad wing of the hangar. As dusk deepened, the horizon turned violet and gold. Through the window she saw the outline of the hangar, its roofline jagged against the sinking light. The wind stirred again, rolling through the grass like the murmur of distant surf. Something about that sound filled her with a strange unease, a feeling of unfinished business. The phone rang as the last of the daylight drained from the windows. The caller ID showed her uncle's number. She let it ring twice before answering. His voice was brisk, impatient, already weighted with business. He asked if she had arrived, if she had looked over the property. Without waiting for a reply, he reminded her of what they had all agreed on. The land needed to be cleared, the hangar torn down, the materials sold off before the taxes piled up. He said it made no sense to linger over the relics of a man who had wasted his life on machines that would never fly again. She listened in silence, staring out at the darkening shape of the hangar, and finally said only that she would take care of it. When she hung up, the phone felt heavy in her hand, like a weight that did not belong to her. Night settled quickly over the desert. The stars appeared one by one, sharp and cold. In the kitchen, she found a bottle of whiskey with an inch of liquid left at the bottom and poured it into a chipped glass. The first sip burned her throat. She sat by the window staring at the faint outline of the hangar in the moonlight and wondered how many nights her father had sat in this same spot, looking at that same shape. What had he seen that no one else could? What had he kept hidden behind those locked doors? The answer came to her not through logic but through memory. When she was small, he had let her sit on his lap while he sketched airplanes on napkins. His hands had been strong, his eyes bright with a kind of calm fire. Once she had asked why he loved machines so much. He had smiled and said, "Because they remind me of freedom, and freedom always needs wings." At the time, she hadn't understood. Now, staring into the darkness, she wondered if that single sentence had been the map to his entire life. Unable to sleep, she wandered through the house again. The clock on the wall still ticked, unbothered by grief. In his study, she found a drawer that stuck halfway open. She tugged until it gave, spilling its contents onto the floor. Old letters, faded photographs, a stack of repair invoices, and a small sealed envelope with her name written across it in his unmistakable hand. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, as if written in haste. She hesitated before opening it, her pulse quickening. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in neat, deliberate script, he had written, "Don't open the hangar until you are ready to see the sky through my eyes." She read the words again and again, but they refused to yield their meaning. Was it a metaphor, a warning, or something literal, something hidden beyond those locked doors? She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. The words seemed to hum faintly against her skin, alive with intent. Outside, the wind had risen. It pushed against the house, rattling the windows, stirring the dust along the porch. Catherine stepped out into the night. The desert stretched around her, silver under the moon. The hangar stood at the far end of the property, half swallowed by shadow. Its metal sides shimmered faintly in the starlight, and from somewhere inside came the low groan of contracting steel. She took a step toward it, then stopped. She felt the pull of it in her chest, a mixture of fear and fascination. It was as if the building itself waited for her, patient and knowing. The wind carried the faint scent of oil and rust, and she thought she could almost hear her father's voice, faint as static, murmuring from within. She stood there until the cold bit through her clothes, then turned back toward the house. In the bedroom, she lay awake for hours, listening to the creaks of the old beams and the distant sighs of the desert. The note burned in her pocket like a secret that refused to sleep. Images came unbidden, her father's hands tightening bolts, his eyes squinting against sunlight, the silhouette of the hangar door closing slowly at dusk. She remembered being a child and asking what he kept in there, and his reply, half smiling, half serious, "Just my unfinished sky." When she finally drifted into a shallow sleep, her dreams were filled with the hum of engines and the smell of metal. She saw wings gleaming under canvas, heard the whisper of a propeller cutting through dawn air. But always there was the sense of waiting, of something just beyond reach, calling her to uncover it. At dawn, she woke with the taste of dust on her lips. The sky outside had turned the pale color of tin. She rose, pulled on her jacket, and stood by the window. The hangar sat motionless in the distance, the morning light sliding across its roof like a slow caress. It looked less like a building now, and more like a relic, a fossil of another era. Yet she could not shake the feeling that it was alive, holding its breath. She made coffee in the old percolator, the aroma mixing with the smell of oil that lingered in the kitchen. Each sound, the drip of water, the click of cooling metal, seemed louder than it should be. The silence of the place pressed against her like altitude, thin and heavy at once. She thought of her uncle's words again, of selling, demolishing, moving on. But something in her resisted the idea as though it were a betrayal. The first rays of sunlight cut across the yard, glinting off the hangar doors. In that moment, she made her decision. She would stay long enough to see what her father had left behind. Not for the family, not for money, but for him and perhaps for herself. When she stepped out onto the porch, the air was cool and clean. The desert shimmered faintly under the rising light. She looked toward the hangar once more, the lock gleaming like a small star. Somewhere deep inside her, a quiet certainty took shape. Whatever lay behind those doors, it had been waiting for her all along. And as the wind moved across the land, carrying the scent of dust and forgotten skies, Catherine Miller understood that her father's final message was not about machinery at all. It was about inheritance, not of land or metal, but of wonder. The hangar was not merely a place. It was the threshold to a story she had yet to read. She turned back toward the house, the note still in her pocket, the weight of its promise guiding her every step. The day was only beginning, and already she could feel the pull of the sky. The next morning came slow and pale, the light creeping across the dry hills like a cautious hand. The air was still cool from the night before, carrying the scent of dust and creosote. Catherine had barely slept. Her mind had wandered in restless circles around the same image, the locked doors of the hangar glinting faintly in the dawn. The note in her pocket felt heavier than paper, a weight that demanded to be answered. She sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee that had long since gone cold, and watched the sunlight crawl across the floorboards until it reached her boots. The sound of the old clock marked the passing seconds with a dull insistence. Each tick seemed to whisper the same word: go. By mid-morning, she could no longer resist. She stepped outside, the wooden steps of the porch creaking under her weight. The desert stretched before her, endless and empty, the kind of silence that swallowed thoughts whole. In the distance, the hangar stood waiting, half shrouded in its own shadow. From this angle, it looked larger than she remembered, its corrugated sides rising like a stranded ship's hull, a monument to her father's solitude. She walked slowly toward it, each step stirring up little spirals of dust that caught the sunlight and vanished. When she reached the doors, the metal was cold beneath her hand. The padlock hung where it always had, streaked with rust, yet solid, as if forged to keep not just people out, but time itself. She pulled the ring of keys from her pocket ones she had found in his desk drawer the night before, and turned them over until she found the one that matched the lock's worn teeth. Her hand trembled slightly as she fitted in place. For a moment she hesitated, feeling the pull of her father's warning. Then she turned the key. The lock gave way with a reluctant groan, a sound that echoed across the yard like a sigh from another world. The doors resisted at first, swollen by years of heat and dust, but when she pushed harder, they moved with a long metallic moan. A rush of air escaped from within, heavy with the scent of oil, rubber, and something older time itself, perhaps, or memory made tangible. The interior lay in half-light, the sun slicing through cracks in the roof to paint narrow golden ladders across the floor. Dust hung suspended in those beams like motes of ash, and beneath them, the vast room breathed with the slow pulse of silence. At first she could not see much. Shapes loomed at the edges of vision shelves stacked with boxes, the angular skeleton of machinery, the ribs of what might once have been wings. But as her eyes adjusted, two massive forms took shape at the far end of the hangar. They stood side by side beneath heavy canvas tarps, their outlines precise and deliberate. The air seemed to tighten around them, as though the room itself acknowledged their presence. She took a cautious step forward. Her boots echoed on the concrete, the sound soft and hollow. The first tarp was immense, draped over a shape whose curves she could almost recognize, smooth fuselage lines, the rise of a cockpit, the arc of a wing. Her pulse quickened. Reaching out, she grasped the edge of the dusty fabric. It felt stiff beneath her fingers, brittle from decades of neglect. With one sharp motion, she pulled it back. A cloud of dust rose into the light, glittering before it fell. Beneath it stood a plane that took her breath away. It was a P-51 Mustang, unmistakable even in the dimness, the legendary fighter of another century. Its body, though dulled by time, retained the sleek grace of purpose, its metal skin catching the light in muted flashes. The propeller blades were still, but their edges gleamed faintly. On the side of the fuselage, in faded but still legible paint, were the words "Lucy's Fire." Her father had never mentioned such a machine. She circled it slowly, her hand hovering above its surface. The smell of oil and old leather surrounded her, the scent of a life that had once roared through the sky. The cockpit canopy was closed, and through the glass she could see the worn seat, the harness, the small control panel still filled with dials and levers. Every part of it bore her father's precision, No sign of rust or neglect, only patience, as if he had maintained it for a moment he knew would come long after his death. When she finally turned to the second tarp, her heart was already pounding. It was larger, the fabric stretched taut across angles that spoke of something more modern. The air seemed to hum faintly as she reached for it, the silence deepening until it felt like the world itself held its breath. She pulled. The canvas slid away and fell to the ground with a soft thud. What it revealed left her speechless. It was not a relic of the past, but a creature of another age, a sleek, unfinished aircraft that combined the soul of a jet with the bones of something experimental. Its nose was narrow, its wings swept back with mathematical precision. The canopy was different, tinted and aerodynamic. The body gleamed with a subtle sheen that suggested composite materials, lighter than steel, stronger than aluminum. Along the side near the cockpit were painted 2 letters in clean white script. E.M., her initials. For a long time she could do nothing but stare. Questions collided in her mind, too many to form into words. Why had he built this? How had he hidden it? What was it meant for? And why had he marked it for her? She walked slowly around it, tracing her fingers along the cool metal. The construction was masterful, joints seamless, welds precise, every detail a reflection of genius. Near the tail, she found a panel open to reveal the inner workings, a blend of jet propulsion and piston mechanics, unlike anything she had ever seen. It was neither warplane nor civilian craft. It was something in between, a bridge across time. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay before her. Her father had not simply tinkered in solitude. He had created, designed, and preserved machines that defied the boundaries of their eras. The Mustang represented history, the second aircraft, an idea one that the world perhaps had never known. The hangar around her no longer seemed just a place of work. It was a cathedral. Each wall held relics of devotion, tools arranged with reverence, shelves lined with bottles of oil and polish, charts pinned carefully in sequence. Near the workbench, at the side of the room, she found a row of notebooks stacked neatly beneath a tarp. Their covers were worn, the paper yellowed. She picked one up and flipped it open. Inside were pages filled with sketches, equations, and handwritten notes in the same precise hand that had written her name on the envelope. Diagrams of engines, airflow models, structural experiments, all annotated with times, temperatures, and results. Between the technical details were sentences written more freely, fragments of thought. They won't understand what I'm building. It isn't for them. It's for the sky. Another page read, E.M. will finish what I began. Her eyes burned. She closed the notebook carefully and placed it back where she had found it. Around her, the hangar felt different now. Not empty, not silent, but alive with echoes. Every surface, every speck of dust seemed charged with the presence of her father, as if his spirit lingered in the air that once carried the hum of engines. Outside, the sun had climbed high, and narrow shafts of light streamed through the broken panes above. They fell directly onto the 2 planes, illuminating their bodies in parallel beams, one golden, one white. It struck her as deliberate, as though the hangar itself recognized them, the past and the future, side by side. She spent hours there without realizing it, exploring, touching, remembering. She found his old flight jacket hanging from a hook, the leather cracked and soft. The insignia of his squadron faded but still proud. On a shelf sat his goggles and helmet, a small stack of fuel ration cards, and a photo of him as a young man standing beside a plane, much like the Mustang. The edges of the photograph were curled, but his smile was unmistakable, confident, unguarded, the expression of someone who belonged to the sky. The realization settled over her slowly. He had never really left that world. While the rest of the family dismissed him as a man lost in nostalgia, he had been building a legacy in secret, piece by piece, preserving not only history but hope. As the light began to fade, the shadows in the hangar lengthened, and the planes seemed to withdraw into themselves, their contours merging again with darkness. The day's warmth ebbed away, replaced by the cool breath of evening. Catherine stood between them, her hands resting at her sides, her mind filled with 1,000 questions. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was sacred. She understood now that whatever her father had done, he had done with purpose, guided by something larger than practicality. When she finally stepped outside, the sky was a wash of orange and violet. The desert stretched endlessly, the horizon quivering with heat ghosts that had not yet faded with the sun. Behind her, the hangar loomed in silhouette, immense and secretive. She closed the doors but did not fasten the lock. The padlock hung loosely, swaying on its clasp, and for the first time she saw it not as a barrier, but as a symbol. The doors no longer felt forbidden. They were an invitation waiting for the right moment. She walked back toward the house, her body heavy with fatigue but her mind wide awake. Every few steps she turned to look back, as though expecting to see movement, a flicker of light, a shadow crossing the hangar windows. But it remained still, its mystery sleeping again under the cover of twilight. In the kitchen she lit a single lamp and poured herself another cup of coffee, though it was far too late for it. The sound of the match flaring filled the silence, and the glow spread softly through the room. On the table lay the note she had unfolded so many times it had begun to crease at the corners. She smoothed it with her palm and read it again, the words taking on a new weight. See the sky through my eyes. Now she understood that the message was not a riddle, but a request. He had wanted her to find the planes, to discover not only what he had built but why. The truth was there, wrapped in metal and memory, waiting for her to have the courage to claim it. Before going to bed, she stepped out once more onto the porch. The moon was rising, silver and watchful, spreading its light across the land. The hangar stood in its glow, patient, unchanged, breathing the cool air of the desert night. From where she stood, she could almost imagine she heard a low hum inside, like the sound of a distant propeller turning in its sleep. She knew she would return to it at dawn. Something inside the hangar had awakened, and it had awakened something inside her too. The door between their worlds had opened, and it would not close again. As she turned to go inside, the wind rose suddenly, carrying with it the faint metallic clang of the padlock against the door. It sounded almost like a heartbeat. She paused, looked back once more, and smiled faintly. The hangar was no longer a place of mystery. It was the beginning of understanding. And though she could not yet grasp the full scope of her father's secret, she felt certain of one thing: the past he had kept hidden was not dead. It was alive, waiting for her to bring it into the light. The night after she first opened the hangar passed without sleep. Every time Catherine closed her eyes, she saw the gleam of metal beneath dust, the careful lines of construction, the initials painted beneath the cockpit window. Her father's presence clung to her, like the smell of oil that had soaked into her skin. When morning came, gray and windless, she rose from the couch with the feeling that she was still dreaming. The silence of the house pressed in on her, filled not with emptiness, but with waiting. Something had begun the moment she lifted those tarps, something that could no longer be undone. She dressed quickly, pulled her hair back, and went to the kitchen. The coffee machine sputtered and hissed as if reluctant to wake. She watched it in silence, her thoughts already elsewhere. The memory of her father's note returned to her with sharper meaning. He hadn't wanted to frighten her. He had wanted her to be ready to look beyond what was visible. The hangar was not merely a shelter for machinery, it was a message, a life's confession written in steel. The air outside was cool and dry. She walked the short path between the house and the hangar, with the same careful steps she had taken the day before. But the feeling was different now. The first time had been trespass. This time felt like permission. When she pulled the doors open, the familiar rush of air greeted her, thick with dust and oil. The two planes stood in their solemn positions, guardians of her father's secret. The light shifted across their polished bodies, and the silence of the space seemed to vibrate faintly, as though the building itself was alive. She began at the workbench, where the notebooks and tools had been left neatly arranged. There was a kind of reverence in the order her father had kept. Wrenches hung from hooks according to size. Jars of screws were labeled in small, precise handwriting. Even the old rags, stiff with grease, were folded. It was not just habit, it was a ritual of control, the way a craftsman imposes meaning on chaos. She realized he must have spent his last years entirely here, alone among the whispers of engines, working with the patience of a monk carving his final cathedral. She opened the first of the notebooks again, turning the pages carefully so as not to tear them. The handwriting was small, dense yet graceful. The early entries were technical measurements of wing load, torque calculations, pressure tests. Then the notes began to change. Between the columns of numbers appeared sentences that had nothing to do with mechanics. "Flight is not a conquest," he had written. "It is the memory of falling, redeemed." In another margin he had drawn the outline of a bird, and next to it the shape of a wing strut, as if searching for the same grace in both. The deeper she read, the more the notebooks became a map of his mind. There were diagrams of the hybrid engine, the one that seemed to combine piston and jet propulsion. He had written long passages about transitional thrust, about finding balance between two eras of technology. And again, one set of initials appeared beside his notes. EM. At first she thought he meant someone else, a collaborator or sponsor. Then she realized he meant her. "If EM ever finishes this," he had scrawled on one page, "she will understand why I stayed behind." Her throat tightened. She turned another page and found a photograph pressed between the leaves. It was old, faded around the edges, showing a young man, her father standing beside a Mustang with a group of other pilots. They were smiling, sleeves rolled up, hands on the wings as if claiming them. Behind them stretched the wide openness of a runway in a sky that seemed almost infinite. Someone had written on the back, Flight Division 17, 1948. He had never spoken of serving in any such division. The family had always thought he had worked as a mechanic, not a pilot. She stared at the picture for a long time, feeling something shift inside her. By midday, she moved from the workbench to the cabinets. The drawers stuck, protesting years of stillness. But she forced them open. Inside were layers of his life stacked like geological strata photographs. Letters, receipts, folded maps, and, beneath it all, a set of blueprints sealed in a weathered leather tube. Her hands trembled slightly as she unrolled them across the table. They were detailed drafts of the two planes she had uncovered, the Mustang and the sleek hybrid. Each part was labeled meticulously, each note precise. In the corner of the second drawing was a phrase written in red ink. "The bridge between Erie must be human." It struck her like a confession. Her father had not simply built machines. He had tried to reconcile time itself. The old world of piston engines and human intuition with the modern world of cold speed and automation. The hybrid aircraft was not only mechanical, but symbolic. It represented continuity, the refusal to let progress erase memory. He had built a testament to what he believed the sky should remain a place where man and machine shared purpose, not opposition. Catherine sank into the chair by the workbench, the weight of discovery settling over her. All her life, the family had treated her father as a man who could not let go of the past, a relic surrounded by rust. But the truth was the opposite. He had looked further ahead than any of them. While they measured worth in money and practicality, he had measured it in vision. The hangar was not the monument of a dreamer, it was the unfinished work of a pioneer. As the hours passed, she found more pieces of the puzzle. A small box under the bench held audio cassettes labeled in the same neat handwriting. On one was written simply, "Test Log, April 1983. She searched for a player and found it on a nearby shelf, coated in dust but functional. When she pressed play, the sound that filled the air made her stop breathing for a moment. It was the low rumble of an engine starting, then her father's voice, calm and deliberate, describing each movement. Throttle response steady, mixture stable, wind from the east. There was the faint rush of air, the whine of acceleration, and then silence, followed by a chuckle, his chuckle, warm and certain. "She flies truer than anything I've ever built," he said softly, as if speaking to himself. Catherine stood listening until the tape clicked to an end. The sound of his voice from decades earlier filled her with both pride and sorrow. He had achieved what no one had believed possible, yet he had done it alone, without witnesses. The solitude of genius was not glory, it was exile. She understood now why he had spoken so little in his later years, why he had grown distant from the rest of the family. They had mocked what they could not comprehend, and in doing so they had driven him deeper into silence. Outside, the sun was beginning to slide toward the horizon. The light that entered the hangar turned amber, softening the harsh outlines of the machines. The Mustang glowed like a sleeping animal. The hybrid shimmered faintly as though aware of her attention. She closed the notebooks, returned the tapes to their box, and leaned against the workbench. Her hands were stained with oil and dust, and yet she felt more alive than she had in years. She thought again of the letter he had left her, and for the first time she felt she could begin to answer it. To see the sky through his eyes was not to look upward in longing, but to understand the devotion that bound him to this work. He had not built these machines for himself. He had built them for continuity, for remembrance, for her. The sharp buzz of her phone startled her from her thoughts. The screen showed her uncle's name again. She hesitated before answering, already bracing herself for his tone. He did not disappoint. His voice came quick and impatient, asking if she had begun sorting the junk, if she had contacted any buyers. He spoke of taxes, of probate, of what he called the sensible thing to do. When she did not reply immediately, his voice hardened. You can't keep it all, Kat. He was a dreamer, not an inventor. Don't let sentiment blind you to reason. Then came the words that stung most. There's nothing in that hangar worth saving. She ended the call without answering. The silence afterward was sharper than before, a silence filled not with absence, but with defiance. They would never understand. They had buried her father with the same indifference they showed in life, convinced his work was meaningless. But now she had seen the truth, and the truth changed everything. The last of the daylight flickered across the hangar floor. She looked around the space once more, the shelves, the tools, the planes, and knew that this was not a place to dismantle. It was a place to preserve. The air itself seemed to hum in agreement, carrying the faint metallic scent of fuel and hope. When she stepped outside, the desert was awash with colors, crimson, gold, violet. The sun had dropped behind the hills, leaving a lingering glow that seemed to come from the earth itself. She stood watching until the first stars appeared, her mind replaying every discovery of the day. There was no longer any question of selling or leaving. The hangar was her inheritance, her responsibility, perhaps even her destiny. She walked back toward the house slowly, her hands still streaked with grease. The air cooled around her, and the first night sounds rose from the scrub, the cry of a distant coyote, the rustle of wind through brittle grass. When she reached the porch, she turned back once more. The hangar loomed behind her, its metal walls catching the faint starlight. In the darkness, it seemed less like a building and more like a heart still beating beneath layers of time. Inside, the house felt different now. The silence no longer seemed empty but full of echoes, as if the walls remembered his footsteps, his voice, the whir of engines. She washed her hands at the sink and watched the dark water swirl away. Then she sat at the table with one of the notebooks open before her. The words blurred slightly as her eyes filled with tears, but she did not wipe them away. She felt no sorrow, only gratitude and a growing sense of purpose. She read until the lamp burned low, until the pages became shadows. When she finally closed the notebook, the decision was already formed in her mind. She would not abandon what he had built. She would learn it, understand it, complete it if she could. The machines were not only his, they were part of her bloodline, her inheritance written in metal and wind. Before she went to bed, she walked to the window and looked out once more at the night. The hangar stood dark and silent, its roof glinting faintly under the stars. Yet she could feel it breathing, the way a mountain or an ocean breathes, slow, ancient, inexorable. She thought of him there, working late into the night, tracing blueprints by lamplight, dreaming of engines that could transcend time. And she realized that he had never truly been alone. Some part of him had always known she would come back, that she would be the one to see what he had seen. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain that would never fall. She closed her eyes, listening. Somewhere beyond the edge of hearing, she imagined the faint thrum of an engine turning over, steady and patient, waiting for the hand that would bring it to life again. She smiled, a small, unguarded smile, and whispered into the stillness, I see it now. The note was still on the table, the words dim in the dying light. She reached out and touched it, feeling the indentation of his handwriting beneath her fingertips. The sentence seemed alive, pulsing faintly with promise. To see the sky through his eyes was to understand that flight was not a past to mourn, but a legacy to continue. And as the lamp flickered and went out, the last image in her mind was of two planes sleeping side by side in the dark, waiting for dawn, waiting for her. Morning came without sound. The desert outside was wrapped in a pale haze, and the horizon shimmered as though the air itself were holding its breath. Catherine awoke before sunrise, the decision she had made in the small hours of the night solidifying with the clarity of daylight. The notebooks lay open on the table beside her, their pages covered in the neat handwriting that had once belonged to her father. They no longer looked like relics of a past life, but instructions, an unfinished conversation waiting for her to answer. She dressed simply, tying her hair back and rolling her sleeves above her elbows, then stepped outside. The sand was cool beneath her boots, scattered with the delicate tracks of night creatures. The hangar stood at the far end of the yard, silent yet somehow awake. As she walked toward it, the rising sun bled orange across the metal roof, bringing out its hidden color. The air carried that same familiar scent of oil, dust, and iron that she had begun to associate with truth. Inside, the air was still heavy but no longer suffocating. The two planes stood in their places like sentinels, their presence no longer intimidating but steadying. She paused near the Mustang, running her fingers over the smooth curve of the fuselage. The metal was cool and faintly trembling with the temperature shift, almost as if it were breathing. Her father had kept this machine alive long after it should have become scrap, feeding it care and reverence instead of fuel. It was not nostalgia. It was love. The thought gave her strength. She crossed to the workbench, set down her coffee, and opened the drawers. The sound of metal scraping against wood filled the stillness as she gathered wrenches, screwdrivers, and oil cans. Every motion she made seemed to mirror her father's, each tool carrying the memory of his hands. When she began to work, the fear she had felt before vanished. She loosened bolts, cleaned out filters, examined valves. The process was not foreign. Years ago, she had helped him here as a child, holding flashlights while he fixed small engines. The muscle memory had stayed hidden, waiting to wake. By midday, the hangar was alive again. The scent of kerosene and polish filled the air, the sound of clinking tools echoing softly from the walls. She spoke aloud now and then, reading from his notes, repeating the instructions as though speaking to him. Each step she completed added another thread to the invisible bridge that was forming between them. She could almost feel him nearby, watching quietly, approving her choices. She realized she could not do it alone forever. There were systems she did not fully understand, instruments that needed calibration beyond her training. That evening, she remembered a name she had seen written in one of the notebooks, M. White. Her father had mentioned him once, years ago, a man who had served with him in the early testing programs. She found an old telephone directory in the drawer, and to her surprise, his name was still listed in a nearby town. The next morning, she drove out early, following the cracked highway until it narrowed into a dirt road lined with mesquite trees. The address led her to a small house on the edge of a dried riverbed. The man who opened the door was thin and stooped, but sharp-eyed, his skin tanned like parchment. When she introduced herself, his expression changed. First recognition, then disbelief, and finally quiet respect. "You're Jim's girl," he said softly, and the words made something in her chest ache. They sat on the porch while she told him about the discovery, about the planes and the notebooks, about the project her father had left unfinished. He listened without interruption, his gaze distant, as though watching old memories unfold across the desert. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "He never stopped talking about that design," he murmured, "said it was the future the world wasn't ready for." He fell silent, then looked at her with a faint smile. "You did right coming back. He'd be proud you opened those doors." He agreed to help her. 2 days later, his old truck rumbled into the yard, carrying a box of instruments, gauges, and tools that looked as old as the Mustang itself. Together, they began the work. Under his guidance, Catherine learned to read the machinery as though it were language, how to listen to the pitch of a tightening bolt, how to sense the balance of weight across a wing span, How to read the story written in oil stains and scratches. The work was slow, deliberate, and strangely intimate. The more they restored, the more she felt she was rebuilding not just machines, but fragments of her father's heart. In the evenings, they sat outside the hangar, watching the light fade from the sky. White spoke sparingly but with precision, telling her pieces of stories about test flights and engine failures, about long nights spent on desert runways waiting for clearance that never came. He told her how her father had once said that machines could carry human souls if built with enough care. "He meant it," White said one night, his eyes on the horizon. "Every plane he made, he gave a piece of himself to it." The work took weeks. The Mustang responded first. Its systems were old but reliable, built to endure. The hybrid, though, was more elusive, its technology unfamiliar even to White. They inspected its twin engines, its composite wings, its intricate fuel system. Some parts were unlike anything he had ever seen. "Your father must have built these himself," he said, tracing a finger along a seamless weld. "This isn't factory work. This is artistry." During those long days, Catherine's relationship with the hangar changed completely. What had once been a relic now became her workshop, her sanctuary. The tools fit her hands as though shaped for them. The rhythm of her movements matched the rhythm of her thoughts. Even the silence between tasks was alive with meaning. But the world beyond the hangar did not stay quiet. Her relatives began to call again. The tone of their voices sharpened when she told them she was still at the property. They accused her of clinging to a fantasy, of wasting time and money on a dead man's obsession. When that failed to move her, they threatened to intervene legally to have the estate sold. One evening, when the sun was sinking behind the hills, her cousin arrived uninvited, his truck grinding up the dirt road in a cloud of dust. He stepped out, wearing the confident look of someone convinced of his righteousness, and told her she was embarrassing the family. He spoke of practicality, of the value of land, of how her father had been a good man, just misguided. She let him speak until his words fell away into the hum of the wind. Then she said quietly, "You don't understand what he built, and you never will." He left without another word. When the dust from his tires settled, she stood alone again beside the hangar, her heart calm. It was not defiance she felt, but clarity. The life she was reclaiming here was not one the world could measure in value. That night, she and White worked until midnight. When they finally reconnected the Mustang's battery and turned the ignition, the engine caught for the first time in decades. The sound was thunder in the confined space, echoing off the walls like applause. The smell of fuel and heat filled the air. White grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "There she is," he said over the noise. "Still breathing." Catherine couldn't speak. The vibration passed through her chest, and for the first time she felt that her father was not gone. He had only changed form. When the roar subsided, the silence that followed felt sacred. The old man clapped her gently on the shoulder before leaving for the night. She stayed behind, sitting on the concrete floor, watching the plane as if it might move on its own. In the dim light, the polished surface of the fuselage reflected her face, blurred but recognizable, a daughter bound by blood and purpose to a man who had lived for the sky. She stayed there until dawn, her back against the warm metal, her eyes heavy but unblinking. The wind outside rose and fell, carrying whispers of dust and time. She realized then that she no longer needed to understand everything her father had done. What mattered was the doing, the act of care, of rebuilding, of refusing to let the silence win. By morning, she knew what came next. The Mustang had woken. Now it was time to awaken the other one. The machine her father had designed for a future he would never see. The notes were there, the calculations, the diagrams. She could almost hear his voice in the margins. If she finishes this, she'll understand. She had thought it was metaphor. Now she saw it as instruction. Before she began the day's work, she walked outside and looked toward the horizon. The first light of dawn touched the hills, and the air smelled faintly of rain. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth on her face, the same light that had once guided her father's flights. "I'm ready," she whispered, though there was no one to hear it. Then she turned and walked back toward the hangar, her steps steady, her heart unburdened. Inside, the planes waited, their wings motionless, their purpose unfinished. The world around her had already moved on, but she had chosen to stay in this place between past and future, where faith was measured not by belief, but by persistence. And as she picked up her tools again, the sound of metal meeting metal filled the air like a heartbeat. The daughter of the pilot was finally home. The morning broke clear and colorless, the kind of sky that seemed to wait for something to disturb its stillness. The desert air was sharp with the scent of oil and fuel, and the ground glittered faintly with dew that would vanish within the hour. Catherine had been awake long before dawn. She stood inside the hangar, her hands on the cold edge of the Mustang's wing, feeling the heartbeat of the world around her slow to match her own. For weeks, she had lived in the rhythm of machines, of restoration and recalibration, of patience and persistence. Now everything had led to this one act, one moment of decision that would either close her father's story or carry it beyond him. The Mustang gleamed in the soft light, its silver skin catching the pale reflection of morning. The engine had been tested twice already. It responded like a creature waking from a long sleep. White had arrived before sunrise, as he always did, his truck rumbling across the yard. He said little that morning. They both understood that words would only break the fragile calm. He moved with quiet efficiency, checking gauges, inspecting hoses, ensuring the bolts were tightened, the fuel lines clear. Catherine followed him, her motions deliberate, her concentration absolute. Each turn of the wrench, each small adjustment carried the weight of her father's trust. When the final checks were done, White straightened slowly and looked at her. His eyes, pale and reflective, seemed to measure her readiness. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the wind. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I think I do," she replied, and they both knew it was true. Together they rolled the plane out into the open. The sunlight caught the edges of the propeller blades and set them shining like glass. The desert around them stretched silent and endless, broken only by the cracked lines of the old runway that ran straight toward the horizon. Once, decades ago, that strip of concrete had launched countless test flights. Now it would serve one more purpose. Catherine climbed into the cockpit. The seat creaked softly beneath her weight, the leather worn smooth from her father's years of use. The harness was stiff but secure. The smell inside was thick with oil, dust, and memory. She placed her hands on the controls, feeling their cool resistance. Her fingers trembled, not with fear but with awe. Outside, White gave a small nod and stepped back, shielding his eyes from the light. When she pressed the starter, the engine turned once, coughed, and roared to life. The noise filled the air like thunder, echoing off the hangar walls and rolling across the flat plain. The vibrations rattled through her bones. For a moment, she could not tell if the trembling came from the plane or from herself. Then she looked at the gauges steady, alive, and knew it was real. The propeller blurred into motion, and the air in front of her shimmered. She taxied slowly down the runway, feeling every bump, every imperfection in the concrete. The Mustang responded with a strength that felt both mechanical and human, as though the spirit of her father guided its balance. The wind caught beneath the wings, whispering, "Not yet, but soon." At the far end of the runway, she paused. The engine idled, the sound low and rhythmic, like a waiting heart. She looked ahead beyond the cracked line of the pavement, beyond the shimmer of heat rising from the sand, to the infinite stretch of sky. The horizon seemed impossibly far, and yet she felt it draw her closer. She thought of all the nights she had watched her father work, of the years he had spent chasing a dream no one else could see. This was his world, and she was standing in the doorway of it. She advanced the throttle. The plane surged forward, the engine's growl deepening into a steady roar. Dust rose behind her in a golden plume. The runway blurred beneath the wheels. The control stick quivered in her grip, alive, eager. The sound grew higher, more urgent, and then, with a sudden lightness that took her breath away, the ground fell away from under her. For an instant, she could not believe it. The world below tilted, and the horizon widened until it seemed to wrap around her. The noise of the engine became a song, loud but beautiful. The sound of effort turned into grace. She felt the weight of gravity loosen, replaced by something she could only describe as recognition. She was where he had lived his whole life, in the space between control and surrender. The sky opened around her like an ocean. She climbed higher, watching the ground shrink until the house and hangar became small, distinct shapes in the pale landscape. The sun glinted off the wings and the cockpit filled with light. The gauges flickered steadily, the needle of each dial vibrating with precision. Every second felt stretched and sacred, a pulse of eternity. In that height, surrounded by silence and air, Catherine felt her father's presence more clearly than ever. It was not a vision, not a voice, but a certainty that filled her chest. The words from his note returned to her. "See the sky through my eyes." Now she understood. It was not about the act of flight alone. It was about seeing the world without boundaries, feeling the unity between earth and air, between craft and soul. She banked gently to the left, the Mustang responding with perfect obedience. The desert below curved away, revealing the long ribbon of the dry river and the shadow of her own plane gliding over it. For a moment it seemed as though another plane flew beside her, its outline faint and golden, a ghost of the past keeping pace. She smiled, her throat tight with emotion. Time lost its meaning. She flew in widening circles, rising and falling with the currents. The clouds above were thin and delicate, like brushstrokes on glass. She thought of her father at this same altitude, perhaps tracing these same invisible paths, feeling the same pull of the horizon. He had not built these machines for glory or for profit. He had built them for this, the communion of flight, the merging of man and creation. After a while she leveled out, turning back toward the runway. The fuel gauge had begun to drop, and she knew the moment could not last forever. The descent was smooth, the air pressing gently against the wings. As she neared the ground, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and hot metal. The wheels touched down lightly, bouncing once before gripping the cracked surface. The roar of the engine softened to a purr, then to silence. When she climbed out of the cockpit, the world felt different, larger, brighter, more intimate all at once. White was standing near the hangar, his face lit by something that might have been pride or relief. She walked toward him, her legs unsteady, her hands trembling from the rush. For a moment neither spoke. Then he simply said, "He would have liked that," and she could not answer because her voice had gone. They pushed the Mustang back into the hangar together. The plane seemed lighter now, almost effortless to move, as if the flight had released something that had been dormant for too long. The scent of hot oil filled the air, and the metal radiated residual warmth. Catherine rested her hand on the nose of the plane and closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids she saw not the hangar or the desert, but the endless blue expanse she had just touched. That night, long after White had gone, she sat alone in the hangar with only the faint hum of the cooling engine for company. The silence was not empty anymore. It was full of echoes, her father's laughter, the rustle of pages, the rhythm of tools clinking on metal. She looked at the second plane, the unfinished hybrid that stood in shadows. Its surface caught the moonlight, gleaming faintly. She walked toward it, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. Up close, the plane looked even more alive. The lines of its body were smooth and deliberate, the craftsmanship meticulous. It was not a machine built for war or display, but for purpose, something pure and original. She traced the initials near the cockpit, her fingertips brushing over the paint. The letters EM seemed to shimmer under her touch, as if responding to her acknowledgement. She whispered her father's name and felt the echo reverberate through the hangar, a soundless pulse of connection. The Mustang's flight had been his gift to her, the way to bridge the years of silence and misunderstanding. But the hybrid, this was her inheritance. It was meant for her, designed not to repeat the past, but to extend it. She realized then that her father had never intended his work to end with him. He had built the beginning of a future, one she would now have to finish. Outside, the stars had gathered across the sky in a slow drift. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint hum of the desert. Catherine stepped to the doorway and looked up. Somewhere high above, invisible in the darkness, was the path she had flown. It would remain there, unseen but eternal, a line of faith drawn between earth and sky. She felt the weight of exhaustion settle over her, but it was a peaceful weight, the kind that comes only after truth. She walked back to the house just before dawn, the horizon still gray and soft. The hangar doors remained open behind her, letting the night wind move freely through. She left them that way deliberately. The planes deserved the sky's breath. Inside, she poured herself a cup of water and sat by the window. The world outside was still. The first faint light of morning brushed the desert, turning it silver. She thought of her father again, the years he had spent alone chasing a dream no one believed in, and she smiled. She had seen the sky through his eyes now. And though the flight had lasted only minutes, its echo would fill the rest of her life. As the sun lifted over the hills, the hangar caught fire with light, its metal roof blazing gold. For a moment it looked less like a building and more like a living thing, a heart beating in rhythm with the rising day. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her eyes half closed, listening to the whisper of wind that seemed to say what she already knew. The story was not over. The next flight was waiting. The morning after the flight dawned with a strange calm. The desert lay hushed, the air too still even for the dust to rise, as if the land itself waited for what came next. Catherine stood by the open doors of the hangar, her hands resting on the cold metal frame, her eyes drawn to the horizon where the pale sun struggled through a thin veil of cloud. Behind her, the two planes gleamed in the early light, one reborn, the other still waiting. The Mustang, with its polished body and loyal hum, felt like an old soldier who had fulfilled his duty. But the hybrid prototype, silent and unfinished, held a different weight. It was not a relic, it was a promise. The echoes of the flight still filled her chest, the vibration of the engine, the rush of wind, the brief, holy moment of release when the earth fell away. The sensation lingered like a living memory, refusing to fade. She could still feel her father there, not as a ghost or an illusion, but as an enduring presence stitched into the sky itself. For the first time since his death, she no longer felt alone. White arrived later that morning, his old truck scattering pebbles across the yard. When he stepped out, his face showed the same weary pride she had seen the day before, but also a new gentleness. He looked at her, at the hangar, at the bright gleam of metal inside. "You did it," he said simply, and she nodded. He walked toward the Mustang and ran a hand along its wing, his touch reverent. "She's better than new," he murmured. Then turning toward the unfinished plane, he added, "And this one? This was always the one he meant for you." The words struck deep. She had known it instinctively, but hearing them spoken aloud gave it gravity. Her father had built the hybrid not for himself, but as a legacy for her to complete. The thought was both daunting and liberating. She stepped closer to the plane, tracing the smooth line of the fuselage. Dust clung to her fingertips, glittering faintly in the sunlight. "I think I understand now," she said softly. He wasn't building machines. He was building meaning. The days that followed became a rhythm of renewal. She and White worked side by side, restoring the hangar to order, repairing tools, cleaning and cataloging every relic her father had left behind. Each discovery deepened her understanding of him. Letters tucked into envelopes bore his looping script notes from fellow pilots, engineers, and friends long gone. Some were technical, filled with sketches and formulas. Others were intimate, filled with gratitude and memories. Many ended with the same words, "Keep the road in the sky alive." She realized that her father had not been forgotten. Beyond this lonely desert, his name had endured among those who lived by engines and open air. Word of her restoration spread slowly but surely. Mechanics from nearby towns visited, offering parts and advice. Pilots sent messages filled with awe and encouragement. "If you ever open it to the public," one letter read, "I'll ride all the way from Nevada to see it." Another said, "We still remember Jack Miller and his Iron Wolves. Some things shouldn't fade." The idea took root before she fully recognized it. It came to her one evening as she sat in the hangar after White had left, surrounded by the quiet hum of night. The planes glimmered faintly under the single overhead lamp. She imagined strangers stepping into this place, seeing what she had seen, the preserved heart of one man's dream. She imagined the sound of footsteps on the concrete, the murmurs of wonder, the realization that this was more than machinery. It was history, devotion, love. The thought filled her with both longing and purpose. She could not let this remain a secret. To lock it away again would be to betray everything her father had lived for. She decided then that the hangar would become something more than a private shrine. It would become a museum, a living testament to Jack Miller and the generations of dreamers like him who refused to let the sky belong only to machines. The decision changed everything. Her days became filled with planning and preparation. She reached out to local historians, aviation clubs, and museums across the state. Some were skeptical at first, others intrigued. White, though old, worked beside her every step of the way, his stubborn energy pushing through fatigue. "If we're doing this," he said, "we'll do it right." They began with the simplest tasks, cleaning every inch of the hangar until it gleamed, cataloging every artifact, photographing every machine. The letters and photographs were preserved under glass. The jackets were treated and hung along the walls. The faded map of the United States was framed, the pins restored where rust had eaten through. Each task took hours. Each detail demanded patience. But Catherine welcomed it. It felt like breathing purpose back into her father's world. The Mustang remained the centerpiece, standing proudly near the front, while the hybrid, still incomplete, occupied the far corner, a symbol of continuity. Visitors, she imagined, would walk through and see the evolution of a man's dream, from polished relic to unfulfilled vision. Her father had bridged eras. Now she would bridge memory and future. But as the dream grew, so too did opposition. Her relatives reappeared, drawn by whispers of her plans. They arrived one hot afternoon, their car crunching over the gravel, their expressions cold with disapproval. David, her uncle, stepped out first, his tie loose, his smile tight. "So this is what you've been doing," he said, gesturing toward the open hangar. "Playing curator to a pile of junk?" Catherine stood by the doorway, her face calm but firm. "It's not junk," she said quietly. "It's his life's work." Her Aunt Martha crossed her arms, her tone dripping with contempt. "His life's work doesn't pay the bills. The land is worth something. This," she waved toward the plains, "is just nostalgia. Sell it while you can. Museums don't run on sentiment." Catherine's voice sharpened, steady with resolve. "Then it won't be a museum that runs on money. It'll be one that runs on memory. You don't have to understand it." They argued for nearly an hour. David spoke of property law and inheritance, of taxes and maintenance costs, but she saw it in his eyes. What he really wanted was to dismantle it all, to sell the planes to collectors and pocket the profit. He would never understand the sanctity of what her father had built. When they finally drove away, muttering threats of lawyers, she felt only relief. For the first time, she realized she no longer feared them. They were bound to the earth by greed. She was bound to the sky by purpose. The following weeks passed in a blur of work. Volunteers began to arrive, mechanics, old pilots, curious townsfolk. The story had spread further than she had expected. People came not for profit, but out of reverence. They brought tools, paint, and parts. One man arrived on a motorcycle from 3 states away, carrying a box of rare bolts and rivets. "These belong here," he said, placing them on the workbench. "Jack helped me once when I was broken grounded. He fixed my plane and refused a dime. Said I'd repay him someday. Guess this is it." With each passing day, the hangar transformed. Fresh coats of paint covered the walls. Lights were installed along the beams. Wooden benches appeared by the entrance. White oversaw the restoration of the hybrid's engine, his hand still steady despite his age. "She'll fly," he said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. "Might take time, but she'll fly." He built her too well for her story to end on the ground. Catherine smiled, her heart tightening with emotion. "Then she'll carry both of us," she replied. By the end of the month, the museum was ready. A simple wooden sign stood near the entrance, its letters carved by hand. The Jack Miller Aviation Heritage Hall. She chose the name deliberately, not a museum of machines, but of heritage, of human will. Beneath it, in smaller letters, she engraved the words her father had once written in his notebook. "Flight is the memory of falling, redeemed." The opening day arrived under a sky so blue it seemed painted. From miles away, she heard the first engines long before she saw them. Riders and pilots, friends and strangers, arrived from every direction. Motorcycles roaring down the highway, trucks carrying veterans in weather jackets, small planes buzzing overhead in salute. The field beside the hangar filled with chrome and color, with laughter and reverent silence alike. When the doors opened, a hush spread through the crowd. The gleam of the Mustang caught the light, and the unfinished hybrid shimmered like a sleeping dream. People stepped forward, some in awe, some in tears. Old men traced the outlines of the wings with trembling hands. Young boys stared wide-eyed at the engines, their faces lit with wonder. Photographs hung along the walls told the story of a man who had lived and breathed the sky. Letters spoke of friendship, loyalty, and sacrifice, and in the center of it all stood Catherine, her father's daughter, the keeper of his legacy. She spoke softly when the time came to address them, her voice trembling but clear. She told them about the man her family had dismissed, the one who built beauty in silence. She told them how he had hidden his greatest work, not out of shame, but out of love for the sky, for the machines, for the truth that only those who dream without permission can understand. He believed that flight was more than movement, she said. It was connection, between people, between time, between what is lost and what remains. When she finished, the applause was not loud but deep, a wave of respect that rolled through the gathered crowd. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, dozens of riders and pilots revved their engines. The air shook with the thunder of machinery, a salute more powerful than words. The noise rose until it seemed to merge with the sky itself. Catherine stood in the center, her eyes closed, tears streaking her face. It was not grief she felt, but completion. Her relatives stood at the edge of the crowd, their faces pale, their expressions hollow. For once, they had nothing to say. They looked around at the sea of people who had come not for money but for meaning, and they understood too late that they had never owned any of this. Not the land, not the planes, not even the memory. It all belonged to something greater. As the engines faded and the crowd dispersed into smaller groups, Catherine walked back into the hangar alone. The light slanted through the open doors, catching motes of dust that drifted like tiny stars. She placed her hand on the hybrid's wing and whispered, "We did it." The silence that followed was complete and peaceful, as if the hangar itself exhaled after years of holding its breath. That evening, when the last visitor had gone, she stood outside watching the sunset bleed across the desert. The sky was streaked with gold and crimson, the same colors her father had loved to paint on his model planes. The sign above the door caught the dying light, glowing softly. The world around her was quiet, but she felt its pulse, a rhythm of engines, of memory, of endless road. She turned to the hangar one last time before night fell. The doors were closed now, but through the small window she could see the reflection of two wings, one old and one new, gleaming in the dimness. Inside that space lay the heart of her father's dream and her own beginning. She touched the key hanging from her neck and smiled. "You ride forever, Dad," she whispered, and as the stars rose over the desert and the first cool wind of night swept across the silent runway, it seemed for an instant that the air trembled with the distant sound of engines, the eternal echo of a man and his daughter, bound forever under the wing of silence. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. There's so much more waiting to be uncovered. Watch the next chapter right now and share this video so more people can discover it too.